Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summers lead their all too short a date. Apparently, the poet has some kind of implicit knowledge how to represent a picture, a thought, a poetic thought, using a time window which is an anthropological universal. Ihr naht euch wieder schwankende Gestalten, die früh sich einst dem trüben Blicke zeigt. So in all languages. Now we're studying actually Chinese poetry from, what is his name? Du Fu, for instance, where you have these 5 or 7 elements that create also a verse length. And so here is one indication, a direct connectivity, I would say, of an anthropological universal which is used to express in a poetic thought. So it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. It's important that you distinguish this to create something like that. No, people come and say, well, the hexameter is different. Auch das Schöne muss sterben, das Menschen und Götter bezwingen. It's one line, but it's a caesura in the line, so it fits quite well. Now, about, I would say, 25 years ago, Professor Semizek and myself were at a meeting in Salzburg. And this was the Easter festival of Herbert von Karajan. And then we were listening to the Flying Dutchman. So we took the motive of the Flying Dutchman and did some experiments now, putting subjects in the scanner and looking and testing how is it if we expand or compress the duration of the motive, because we have found out that musical motives in many languages, in the musical cultures, let's say the Viennese tradition from Haydn to Mahler, but it fits also to Japanese music, they fit very nicely in this temporal window. Now when you do that, you have a very nice brain activation when you present it with the Karajan tempo, approximately 3 seconds. But when you compress it or dilate it, you have no problems in cognitively recognizing the motive. But you have a completely different, actually reduced brain activation. So here we have a biological marker, I would say, for something like an aesthetic appreciation of what is meant by the composer. So we may have a handle to answer a question which was posed by Richard Wagner, who said, you have understood a musical piece if you have understood the tempo. Now the tempo is of course not in the notes. There must be some kind of conceptual or aesthetic or emotional or empathic relationship to what you see in the notes on the music. So we have something like a universal principle of temporal segmentation, a temporal window, which is sort of used apparently with intuitive or implicit knowledge by the artist. But this is also true, by the way, now in paintings. If you go to Cubism and you look, well, in experimental psychology we have figures like a Necker cube where you have different perspectives. Now you cannot prevent that you see the alternative interpretation after a few seconds. Actually, it's again 2 to 3 seconds. And these artists like Klee, Picasso, Braque, Feininger has the best pictures here, I would say. These are sort of experimental possibilities for us where you have one picture, but because of the construction the artists use Necker cubes and other ambiguous figures, you create an internal dynamic, and which you can actually not, man ist ausgeliefert. What is ausgeliefert? Well, sometimes it's a... No, you cannot prevent... Forced to something. It's interesting. The other languages have different kind of ways to express it. So in this sense, I think we have identified, I would say, an internal matrix in the time domain where we create the identity for a percept for some time, but after a few seconds the brain is always asking, what's new in the world? What's new? And then either it's something else is coming in or you reinforce what you have represented. Now this may actually relate to this discussion on the others. When we communicate with each other, we are in the same time now. We share a common presence. And so I think it's quite important when one, in a discussion or in acting and all that, create a common presence and relying on this empathic relationship. One could talk more about this. I would like to now have another point which refers also to identity, no, not short-term identity, but to personal identity. We have done some research now with hundreds of subjects on the content of episodic memory. Now, everybody now can make a time travel to her or his own past. And imagine a scene when you were 10 years old, or 15, or 8, or whatever. And what you will recognize is there are three things. It's an image or picture. It's always sort of somewhere, so it's der Platz, der Ort, the place. It's not a virtual place. It's a real place, and it was an emotion that was necessary to imprint it in our brain. Now, what we observed, which is quite, which was a surprise, that quite a few people report when you study your own images in the past, you yourself are present in the image of your own past. So you refer to yourself in time traveling and become your own doppelganger. Yeah. And so you do not look in your face, but the mirror neurons somehow have projected myself in the picture, and I look over my own shoulder. And we think, well, I think, how to interpret this stuff is that we create and maintain our personal identity because we can become our own doppelganger. We double ourselves. And the problem, well, I come from medicine, the problem in Alzheimer, for instance, is not so much the memory loss, but the impossibility to create a relationship to yourself in your own episodic memory. So I think this result of how am I represented in my own memory system is actually might be interesting and important for the discussion art and science. It may also be important perhaps for the discussion on propositional cognitive representation of information and pictorial. It is quite clear to us, or to me at least, when you time travel to the pictures of your own past, and you refer today to picture yesterday and tomorrow to picture yesterday, so have a longer time distance, pictures are fading away, colors disappear, contours disappear, and that's only possible if it's a pictorial and not a propositional representation. So this again may give an answer to a discussion we have in neuroscience. Maybe it even is interesting to a discussion in art and science. Quick reflections on what I wrote down here, and I finished then. We should not sit in the language trap as neuroscientists. We should not allow to talk about attention, consciousness, beauty, and things like this. Is in our Platonic, let's say, tradition. We ontologize these things, and this is not how the brain was meant to be. So we are misled by language. Then the relationship between emotions, motor system. Well, the neuroanatomy I learned mainly from Wallenauter, who was an eminent neuroanatomist. This is a very, very close connectivity between all neurons in our brain. So the maximal 4 steps are necessary to come from somewhere to somewhere. So necessarily when we have an emotion, it's a link to memory systems, to action systems, and all that. Let me quote David Hume: reason is and ought to be the slave of passions. So, well, this is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
The time is finished, but maybe if somebody wants to say something, there is 2 minutes. The last words.
I think we can have another 15 minutes if there is some. Yes, please, Philippe Ram. Maybe I just want to give my personal impression. I think for me the interest into science, it's really it's not to, because in this discussion we have the feeling that we try to explain a little the art through the scientific knowledge or something like this. And for me, my personal interest into science was also to to enlarge the field of the perception of things. And you say beyond senses. For me, it was really. I prepared just a small presentation, and it was called Beyond Senses. And it was really this idea because I work as an architect on space, and my feeling was that the perception of space is completely different today than 20 years ago, because we know today the melatonin hormone that changed completely the way to understand the perception of space, of light, and each if we think about the space, there is some ion some ion in the air, there is some electromagnetic wavelengths, there is some full of different things, and for me it's really interesting to have this knowledge and to understand that space is not only, it's all these different field, and so my personal interest is to know this and to understand if all these new parameters become new tools for architecture and to use it in the project of architecture.
But now you open up a completely new thing. When what we discuss here is always a visual representation with a radius of about 10 degrees or so. But we have a completely different system that tells us where we are, which is actually basically implicit information processing. And this, you as an architect, it's quite essential. But what we do here is a very, very limited view towards the visual system. We have to confess that.
Yeah.
But that is,
I think, I've blogged about you.
yeah, you did. Yes. Heathrow 5, I think.
Yeah. Well, you see,
Don't believe what you
no, but there are very interesting things which in terms of space representation and loss of oneself in space, that, for example, who designed Heathrow 5? Norman Foster. Heathrow 5 was Norman Foster? Well, he is a very, very poor architect from the point of view of human behavior, human conduct, and looking up scientific facts. Do you agree with that? I mean, do you know something? Look, I'll give you a very simple example. There is a very, very straightforward and very elemental reward system in the brain. When you push a button, something happens. At Heathrow 5, you have no button to push. You have no control, no light. The lift stops or does not stop. Yeah. But I think in a grand sense, you have looked at temperatures and stuff like that, and it seems to me that this is this is one way in which neuroscience could actually influence things. Yeah.
why he's here actually because he's one of the I think some artists more than others can profit from neuroscience and can really use your knowledge to produce another knowledge that is art, and Philippe is one of them. And I think maybe one day we can really realize a work of art with him, for example, that can be a result of our common language now. This would be fantastic. Somewhere.
Daniel Margulies wants to conclude.
Oh, I don't want to conclude.
No, okay,
anything.
the last one, so you conclude.
Oh boy. Wow, that puts the pressure on. But Daniel Margulies, neuroscientist. But building off of that, there's an aspect that hasn't been addressed as much, it seems, of how these products of art and theory from art could be used also to influence neuroscientific practice. And as just a thinking point, I would kind of leave it there. That's quite a bit of pressure.
No, don't worry.
But yeah, it seems that if any of these temporal windows, for instance, that you were discussing, or some of the other examples we've seen today, are also going to be equally applicable to the way that neuroscience interprets its findings and its facts. And while no doubt there are facts that are emerging from neuroscience, there is a lot of space in discussions in papers and interpretation of results that are open to the same possibilities of interpretation and should necessarily be more transparent and open to addressing them in the same way that art would be willing to address those kinds of issues. So there's much to learn from both sides of these practices.
My point here, I think I use data from poetry and music as scientific data because apparently artists are they cannot jump out of the frame of our brain work. Yeah. So there is some kind of implicit intuitive knowledge which necessarily has to be used. If you go beyond, you no longer are sort of in the human sphere. And so we learn quite a lot actually as scientists from the arts.
There is a question